Hi, it's James Furlow here. I thought I'd try a little bit different format this month because the attendance hasn't been super high on the Zoom calls, and I read a book this month or I listened to one really, that was really good, and I wanted to be able to share it with everybody because I think it's super important for landlords to understand the other side of the transaction, the tenant side. And this book, I think, is especially important during this time. I saw one of those lists floating around that was, if you want to learn more about discrimination that's happening in the US, here's a list of books to read. And this was one that I felt really was the intersection of what I'm interested in, which is real estate investing, and discrimination and poverty. And so it's just a great book. And I'd like to share with you what I learned. I got my notes here, so I don't forget anything. So it's a little bit unscripted in that regards, but you know what? I think that's going to be okay. So the book is called Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and it's a pretty interesting book. He's an ethnographer and a professor at Harvard. And what he did was he lived in a trailer park in Milwaukee. It was for a few years. And what he does is, in this book, he follows 8 tenants and 2 landlords. So you kind of see both perspectives. And the typical writing style of an ethnographer is to do like a first-person narrative account while he throws in some stats about saying, look, this isn't just a one-off situation. This is actually something of a bigger trend. So I thought it was really good. His main thesis is that evictions can cause significant damage to individuals, families, and communities, and it can lead to a downward spiral of poverty and exploitation. And so I'm going to share with you a bunch of stories that kind of encapsulate this idea. He does get to solutions at the end of the book, and so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to share the solutions at the end of this. So I definitely think it's worth listening to the entire thing. But what I think he does is he does a great job of painting the picture of how hard it can be for some people in America. And I'll talk about some of the takeaways at the end. What I do appreciate about what he does too is that he just mostly shares stories. There's some commentary, but a lot of it is just saying, here's what I saw and observed. And so I'm going to do the same thing. Here's what I heard, and I'm going to try to not add a lot of my own filters and biases to it, but instead let you interpret me interpreting what he said, I guess. That's okay. So like I said, this takes place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's the largest city, and it is the most segregated city in the country. It actually ranks the highest when it comes to the disparity between black and white medium household income. And again, there's definitely this book talks about discrimination, that's definitely a part of it, but I also think it's a big part of it is just talking about poverty. That's probably a bigger theme in this book. I'm not going to dive into a bunch of the stats right now, but one of the reasons why he chose Milwaukee is because it does have such extreme levels of poverty and segregation in the U.S. And by the way, the one state that is competing with Wisconsin for the most disparity is Minnesota. And so I think in that regards, it's also highly relevant. All right, let's talk about some of these stories here because I think they're worth sharing. So it talks about Milwaukee. It starts off, okay, I'm going to be honest too. This is probably one of the most difficult books that I've listened to. It was one where I really felt, when I saw it, it was a book where I went, I actually don't think I want to read this book, but I feel like I need to read this book. And that was definitely my experience throughout reading it. One of the books where I've probably just felt the saddest while reading it. And it's just hard. So for example, it starts off with a story where there's these boys who are throwing snowballs at passing cars. This is in January of 2008, and that's kind of the time frame when all these stories take place. And they hit a car, and this man, he gets out of his car, and he chases the boys into the house and actually knocks down the door. Now, he doesn't hurt the kids, but he yells at them. Well, in the process of that, the landlord found out about the damage and therefore evicted the single mother, her name is Arlene, and her sons. And there's a part of me that says, okay, something might have been going on there where the kids are already throwing snowballs at cars, which isn't great. And obviously this man's reaction was highly inappropriate as well. But needless to say, landlords can evict tenants pretty much any time for not paying their rent and for other violations. And they do say that landlords are prohibited from retaliating against tenants who contact the Department of Neighborhood Services. But there appears to be just enough loopholes where they say, well, I'm not retaliating, because there were just enough other issues that the landlord was kind of letting go that they just pick one of the other ones and say, no, it's not retaliation. And at least at this time, that was allowed. So this lady, Arlene, she eventually agrees. She finds a place from a landlord. Her name is Sharina. And by the way, all these names were made up for the purpose of the book, so I don't think I'm outing anybody. Anyway, so Arlene is able to rent a place from a lady named Sharina. And she's after this local caseworker offers to pay Arlene's security deposit and her first month's rent. So that's something, depending on your interactions with some tenants, even in this area in Oregon, you definitely have experienced that. CSC, Community Consortium Services, CSC, yeah, or SCS, that's it, or something. Anyways, they often will do this. They will, to help someone get into the home. Now, obviously, they need to be able to demonstrate that they'll be able to make payments going forward, but it's like that, those moving costs can be quite a lot. So anyways, so that's what happens here. Now, what's interesting about this is that it says that Arlene, she paid 88% of her $628 a month welfare check in rent. And that's something that actually kind of shocked me. And he says here that the majority of poor families renting they spend over half their income on housing. 1 in 4 pays over 70% in rent and utilities. And I started thinking about this and I was like, oh my gosh, could I imagine paying 88% of my rent to housing and utilities? Which is quite a lot. Usually, as a rule, I require tenants to be able to, their income needs to be 3 times the rent. In other words, I want no more than 33%, not 88% of the rent going towards, or the income going towards rent. Now, what's interesting about that is it also tends to lock out certain individuals from renting from me. And this is definitely something that I'm trying to think through in terms of how do I help in that situation? Because I do regularly have people who they're willing to pay like 55% of their income. Especially, I've got a lower income property, and it's and it's also a studio. It's like 200 square foot studio, so it's not a very big place in a more rural, poor part of the country, and it's not Milwaukee by any stretch, but I will regularly have people who apply who they're on some sort of fixed income, and let's say the rent's $500, they will say, oh, I make $1,100 a month, and they go, plenty, I can move in, I'll always pay my rent on time, and this is something that I personally struggle with, where it's like, okay, I get that, and assuming that life goes absolutely perfect, you're probably right, you can pay your rent on time. But what happens when life doesn't go perfect? Because there are fixed costs, and to be honest, like that's just not a lot of buffer. So that's something that I struggle with. And landlords like Sharina just go, yeah, whatever, if I don't care what your percentage is. She's usually not even doing background checks or credit checks, things like that. She's like, yeah, just pay your rent. Yeah, kind of interesting. So 3 out of 4 families in America who qualify for assistance receive nothing. And so in Milwaukee, the list for rental assistance is frozen, and in larger cities, the wait for public housing is counted in decades. I thought that was surprising, because that would be one solution, right? I understand that you're only making $1,100. My rent is $500. In theory, you should only have to pay a third of your income. Let's say $300. Ideally, like they could get some sort of assistance to, like they pay $300 and the assistance pays $200, something like that. That would seem like a fair compromise. The problem is, like he said here, 3 out of 4 families just don't qualify, either because of the size of the program or whatever the reason is. So the story goes on, and Arlene's sister dies, unfortunately, and she struggled to pay for her sister's funeral. And the landlord, Sharina, she loaned her $320, believing that she'd get assistance from the state to help her because of her extended family. Well, she didn't. And it got even worse than that. Her welfare benefits were decreased after she missed an appointment because of all this stuff going on. So Serena, she decides to evict Arlene. And at eviction court, Arlene, she agrees to voluntarily move out before before Sharina requires her to with the sheriff. And this is gonna, the story's gonna continue on because it gets even more interesting and more sad, if I'm honest. But some general stats that he shares in the book. So unlike in criminal court, in a civil court, poor people have no right to an attorney. And so in many housing courts across the country, 90% of landlords have attorneys and 90% of tenants do not. And even worse, 70% of tenants summoned to Milwaukee's eviction court don't even show up. And almost all tenants were summoned for missing rent payments. Now, I actually had a situation when we first got started, actually. It was two people who were living together, and they gave us their rental notice to move out. And one of them moved out, no problem. It was absolutely perfect. The second one, she did or she didn't. She just didn't move out. And after trying to contact her, it was like, look, you guys gave us the notice. Like, it's time for you to move out. And we ultimately went all the way down the path to court. And yeah, this is going to sound horrible. I was actually kind of excited for it because I had never been inside of a real courtroom. I had just seen shows like Law and Order. And I was like, oh yeah, a real courtroom. This will be cool. I'm going to learn something. And it was super boring because they called my name first and they didn't show up. And so they're like, all right, James versus whoever it was. And they didn't show up. And he goes, all right, done. Strikes are grabbed. Didn't read it, didn't care at all about any of the details. And it was done. And I won. And there was a judgment, which I never collected on because I didn't expect to. And and then we kind of went from there. The really sad part about that, by the way, was after I got the eviction, after it was officially on record, and I had scheduled a time for the police to show up and unlock the door for me, she showed up that night and grabbed all her stuff, gave me the keys, and left. It's just like, you couldn't figure out how to do it a day earlier. But again, like now that I'm reading this book, like there's definitely something that was going on in her life. And I don't know how I could or should have handled it differently, but it's definitely getting me to think about it. In a typical month in Milwaukee eviction courts, 3 in 4 people are black. Of those, 3 in 4 are women. One female renter in 17 is evicted through the court system each year, which is twice as often as men and 9 times as often as women from the city's poorest white areas. So women from black neighborhoods make up 9% of Milwaukee's population, but 30% of evicted tenants. And what was interesting about this, I was trying to be like, they were trying to hypothesize into what's going on here. And one of the guesses really is just because women don't tend to confront their landlords as much. And so he gave an example where when a landlord handed out an eviction notice, a woman would tend to go talk to their parents or their family, try to work with someone else to figure it out, whereas the men would often confront the landlord directly, go straight to him and say, hey, here's the deal, here's what I want to do. And oftentimes the men would come up with a solution with the landlord, the person who was kind of in control of the situation, if you will. Whereas the women tended not to do that. And so it actually resulted in a lot more evictions. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just that's one of the tendencies. And you can see that this is, the result is that women tend to get evicted a lot more. The other reason that he gave is that when there's a couple that have kids together and things go wrong, the men just tend to leave and then they go get a job and they can afford the rent, whereas the women, I'm going to say are stuck with the kids, but that's not a fair way to say it. But they keep the kids with them, which makes it harder to get a job. Their expenses are generally higher, and housing costs are the same for both people, and so that also makes it harder for them. And so I think one of the takeaways you're going to get from this book is that it's complicated. It's not just a real simple, hey, you didn't work hard and therefore you didn't pay your rent. It's really hard. I'm going to give some more examples here. So anyways, we get back to Arlene. She's been told to leave. Well, in that process, Sharina finds someone new to live in this unit, and her name is Crystal. And Crystal allowed Arlene and her boys to stay with her until they found another place to live, which was super nice on Crystal's part. Now here's what's interesting. They were in a duplex, and there was another lady who had a boyfriend who was abusing her. And so one of the things that Crystal did was so Arlene is staying there with Crystal, and Sharina knows about it, but nothing's written down for this, which is interesting. And then there's another lady living there who has a boyfriend who I don't think he was on the lease either. But anyways, he was abusing her. So Crystal, she calls 911 after hearing the domestic disturbance upstairs. And so here's what's so interesting. This subjected Serena to additional law enforcement costs because her property was designated as a nuisance property. And the nuisance property ordinance allows police to penalize landlords for their tenants' behavior. I thought that's an interesting solution to a problem that they were trying to solve. So they talk about in white neighborhoods, 1 in 41 properties that could receive a nuisance citation, they do receive one. In black neighborhoods, it's 1 in 16, so it's over twice as many. And then the number of the domestic violence incidents exceed the total number of all other kinds of assaults. That includes like disorderly conduct and drug-related crimes. In 83% of the cases, landlords who receive a nuisance citation for domestic violence either evict tenants or threaten to evict them because of future police calls. So this is so sad. This places domestic violence survivors in a almost impossible situation. They can either call 911 and risk an eviction or not call and risk more abuse. There's one part of the book here where the police chief, he actually laments over the domestic abuse cases and says, all they need to do is call us. We can help them. And it seems like he doesn't realize, I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt and just say that he doesn't realize that the system is broken. I've got to imagine that it was originally set up with good intentions, right? Like, let's get the landlords involved. Let's get them on the hook to help solve the situation. But unfortunately, the system it optimized around evictions instead of helping people with domestic problems. And so just super hard. So that's what Serena does, right? She hands out an eviction to all of them. So here's Arlene, again, who was living in a place without a rental agreement, but was tacitly allowed to live there. And because of someone else calling, because someone else was being abused, now she is facing an eviction because it's a nuisance property. So she has 3 days to find an apartment. And it's freezing cold weather. This is during the middle of winter. She's got a friend named Carol. She agrees to let Arlene, live there. She moves her possessions into storage, and we'll talk a little bit more about that storage stuff later. And then she ends up calling. So she's trying to figure out a place. She finds someone named Carol. Who's like, yeah, you could totally rent from us. And then it turns out that Arlene was like, all right, we're doing it. And then Carol's like, oh, just kidding. I found someone else. Sorry, good luck. So Arlene puts her stuff into storage. She's living in a shelter. She applied to 90 different places, which is just kind of crazy. And it was on the 90th one that they finally said yes. During that time, her son, Jory, he attended 5 different schools between 7th and 8th grade. Which leads to all sorts of other problems when a kid is moving around that much. So shortly after she moved into that 90th place, her son, he kicked his teacher, and a police officer followed him home. And then the landlord found out about it and said, you know what, I'm just going to refund your deposit and your rent. You got to find a new place. So here's a situation where her child is struggling because of all the moves and just the disturbance in life. And that causes more problems. And what's interesting is because of the way the landlord handled it, it's technically not an eviction, but it's still a forced move. And what's sad is that now her son, Jory, he's behind in school and most likely to follow a similar, if not worse, path. So it really is this horrible downward spiral that is not easy to get out of. Eventually, she moves on, and the story just kind of finishes with her stuff that she had in storage. She's not able to pay for it, and she just loses it all. They just trash it, and it's just a sad end for her. It's not a happy ending. So that's the first story. That's the longest. Don't worry, the rest of them are shorter. But I think it's just this great example of how hard things can be for someone. And it's not necessarily because she just made poor choice after poor choice after poor choice, but more of she was in a very difficult situation where things had to go absolutely perfectly for her to pull out of it, and they didn't. and she wasn't able to pull out of it. Story number 2, there's a place called, I'm sure it's not called this, but College Mobile Home Park. And there's an owner there. And for all these places, on average, in each month, there's nearly 1/3 of the park's residents are behind on their rent. And one of the things that this owner does, his name is Tobin, is he offers new tenants the handyman special, where essentially says, I will give you the trailer, you can have it for free, it's yours, all you got to do is pay lot rent, which just so happens to be the same as if you were renting the trailer. But now that the tenants own it, they are on the hook and responsible for the maintenance, not him. So that's just one of those things they do, and people are like, oh yeah, cool, sounds great. And as far as they're concerned, they're like, well, I was paying the same no matter what. But what they don't realize is that now they're on the hook for maintenance. Yeah, and in theory, like they could resell it and get their money back, or resell it, I guess. But they don't. Another interesting thing here is that their vacancy rate was below 4%. So we had very little incentive to lower the rents or forgive late payments. Though having said that, they painted this very interesting picture where Tobin, he was willing to work with residents, find compromises. It really gave off this this community vibe. It's like, hey, I want you to pay rent, but if you work with me, I'll work with you. Give me a little bit and I'll give you a little bit and we'll try to figure it out. And so he worked with a lot of people there. And it really got this sense of like cooperation and fairness. It was you're like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then Milwaukee's license committee refused to renew Tobin's license to operate the trailer park. They pointed to 70 code violations and 260 police calls. They ended up finding some sort of compromise where there were a bunch of changes that he had to make, including bringing in a third-party property management to take care of it, which everyone was like, oh no, now they're not going to work with us anymore. And what ultimately you learned was that it was his willingness to work with them was good, but he just went too far. I listened to this really cool podcast that was talking about leadership. And one of the things it talked about was tough love. And it said, well, basically, leaders have high standards, which is good. They're like, great, you should have that. They go, but then if you have someone who's not quite performing, what we tend to do, because we love them, because we care for them, because we have empathy, what we'll do is we'll say, well, I'll lower the standards for you. I'm going to try to make it a little bit easier for you. I go, but then ultimately what happens is at the end of the day, those original standards were set for a reason. They go, either one of two things happen. You just have this slow degradation and things get worse and worse and worse, or eventually this leader gets fed up of the low quality work because they were kind of hoping, well, like give them a break now and then maybe they'll get better over time, and they just don't. And so then they get fed up and then they blow up on them again. And so the book talks about you got to have like tough love. You got to say, look, like this is the standard. I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to help you. I'm going to coach you. I'm going to like give you all the resources I can to get you there. But at the end of the day, this standard is not changing. And that's not what Tobin did. He kept lowering the standard and then lowering it to the point where they were like, no, we're not even going to renew your license anymore. So this new management company, they come in, they fire the existing staff. And one of the things that it points out is that Tobin's annual income was $447,000 a year. So that put him into the top 1% of income earners, which I'm like, wow, yeah, that's a lot of money, significantly more than me. Now, most of his tenants belong to the bottom 10%. So there's this big disparity here. And at the end of the day, what it was is he was making money and just was choosing to pocket the profits instead of building up this trailer park and making it better. Now, this actually sounds really similar to what Facebook is going through. Now, hold with me here. I'm going to make this connection for you. Facebook's margins are crazy high, but they have a similar issue with the quality of posts. Think like, fake news types of stuff. And what they've said is like, well, there's not much we can do about it. It's hard to control. And to me, that sounds exactly like what Tobin, this owner, was saying. They're just unwilling to invest it more to maintain their space. They could hire an entire cadre of content curators and people watching it, keeping up on it, and following it. They could do it. This is what newspapers do, right? They've taken it to the extreme of saying, we're not even going to we won't even let other people submit it. We're going to hire people to do the posting. And I get like news is different than social media, but at the end of the day, there is this weird hybrid. Facebook could invest. They could lower their margins down to Walmart level margins if they wanted to, and they choose not to. That's a choice. Now, to be honest, that does produce more profit margins in the short term, but like Tobin, that can create a huge problem in the long term. And that's something that's going to be interesting to watch places like Facebook and Twitter and such, where, okay, what choice do they make in terms of where they decide to invest, and then what effect is that going to have in the long term? Oh yeah, and it was just interesting. They talked about in a trailer park, especially one like this one, people never considered it their permanent residence. They were just temporarily there, even if they were temporarily there for 15 years. But it was this mindset of saying, no, I'm not going to invest in the place. I'm not going to make it better. I'm not going to make it safe. I'm just here temporarily. And that also had a bad impact on the culture there. All right. Story number 3. Yeah, it doesn't get better, in case you were hoping. So there's 3 generations of this family that lives in one of Sharina's rental properties. And before they were living there, they were in a nicer place. It was a state-funded type of place. But what happened was that the landlord filed a 5-day eviction notice after a building inspector, summoned following a neighborhood shooting and police investigation, issued repair orders. It was one of those where they just went, oh, it was cheaper to evict them and to bring in new people than to fix the issues, I guess. Either way, she moved into this new place with Sharina, and the quality of the unit wasn't great. This lady who lives there, her name is Doreen, she hires a plumber to repair a non-working bathtub, sink, and toilet. And as a result of her hiring a plumber, she withheld that amount from her rent, which, as you probably imagine, did not go over well, being given the passive-aggressive nature of that one. And so she was then threatened with an eviction. Families like that, they're often compelled to accept substandard housing for the aftermath of eviction. So again, they were evicted, and so they found a place that didn't have a working bathtub, sink, or toilet, but they moved in anyways. And then when they tried to fix it, it caused other problems. And again, for many landlords, evictions are often cheaper than the cost of maintaining rental properties. I guess it's a business model, but it's not a great one when it comes to actually respecting and treating other people fairly. Let's see here. Oh yeah, this was an interesting comment that the author made. He said, the house failed the tenants and the tenants failed the house. The family became lethargic and depressed. The children missed homework and their grades dropped. And this is another just downward spiral situation. And it's horribly sad. And I totally get it, right? If you're in an environment like that, you would just slow down and lose your luster and excitement to live life and to strive and to go for something greater. I was trying to imagine, what would that effect be on myself in my life if I was living in the middle of that? I mean, and I know my wife and I, we've lived in the middle of rehab projects, which presents a whole different set of issues and is usually super high stress just because there's always dust and there's dirt and there's something going on and there's this part of the house that we used to have access to that now we don't because it's all cleared off. Heck, even in this house that we're living in now, I remember when we redid our master bathroom, and it took me a while, and it was just all tiled off, but we used this other bathroom. And there was just certain things that we did, like having a hose running from our sink into the shower because it didn't have a shower head, which meant we then had to wash our hands somewhere else. And it just added this level of complexity to it. So I can imagine a similar thing if you're in a house that's broken that you don't even want to invest in because it's not your house. Your landlord should be taking care of this. How that would just cause frustration and troubles and just be this downward spiral. All right, story number 4. This is an interesting one. This guy named Scott, he was a nurse, and he was living a normal life, earning $88,000 per year, living in a nice apartment, living life. Now, the interesting thing about him was that Scott was a homosexual, and as a result, had moved away from family, had very little contact with them. And then he injured his back, and as a result, he got addicted to painkillers and some other opioids. And then what happened to him was his doctor, who was providing the drugs for him, retired, and at the same time he had 2 friends who also passed away, and he freaked out. And one of my takeaways from that was, here's a guy who didn't have a support system. He had some friends, and his doctor was his main like confident person he talked to. And then when the doctor left, because the doctor was like, dude, whatever, you're just a patient. Not an appropriate person to be like your close friend, I guess. He just didn't have the support network anymore. And a lot of it was because, of where he was in life and where he wasn't with on his family. And so as a result, he then turned to more nefarious ways of getting drugs and painkillers. Primarily, he started buying them from his patients, and then eventually he stopped buying them and just started taking them. Well, as you could imagine, he got caught and his nursing's license was revoked. Through that, he ended up moving into that same trailer park that Tobin owned, and he lived with an older guy, and he helped with the cooking, cleaning, shopping, and helped this other guy manage his partial paralysis. And one of the things he talked about was he was like, yeah, it was super nice because like I felt like I was helping somebody, just like I was a nurse again. While he was at the trailer park, he was looking for a painkiller fix, didn't have much money, and while walking around, met someone else who was there who introduced him to heroin, and he just went one level deeper in terms of his addiction and his problems. And his rock bottom was pretty bad, right? At one time, eventually he gets evicted, and he's homeless, he has no food, and really all they wanted were more drugs. Eventually, though, he does have this desire to say, no, I want to clean up my life, I want to get back to the nursing, I want to get back on track. And so he started working to get it back. He was required to attend bi-weekly AA meetings, and he had to pay to have his urine tested at least once per week, and he had to stay sober for 5 years. So that's what you got to do. And he started doing it, and it was really incredibly hard. But then he had a relapse back into heroin after he learned that the AA and group therapy sessions he attended and the clean urine drops he had made did not count towards his nursing's license. And I get it. You see this happen where there's someone who, they're trying hard, like they genuinely have good intentions, but they're just not technically doing it right. Like he's just, like the place where he was doing the drops didn't count, or he didn't fully understand the rules. And this is just incredibly frustrating for people. And I'm sure you've had this in your own life where you thought you're doing something right, you find out you're not, and you're like, great. Now what? And for a lot of people, this causes them to just give up. And the sad part is like the information is out there, but the people who need it most can't access it. So I got two related points to this. I have a tenant who, she never received her $1,200 relief check. She doesn't have a checking account, and because she's, poor. And for whatever reason, she did not receive that prepaid card. That's what they said they would be giving to people who didn't file taxes or didn't have a bank account or things like that. So she's tried calling the place, but all she gets is just on hold the entire time. Here's a person who needs the help, who needs that check more than any other tenant that I have, and she can't get the help that she needs. And I would imagine, to me, I'm like, that's incredibly frustrating. The systems are there, and she can't do it. The other related point here is that the book, it talks about how poor people look for rentals. They say they drive around town, and they call signs that they can see. Very few of them actually look into the newspaper, and almost none of them look online, like on Craigslist. And so it's this another situation where there are better systems, there are other resources, there are expanded rentals that people could look at, but they just don't know about it, or they don't use it. And don't think because they don't have access to the internet, they couldn't do it. He specifically shared a story of a lady who, and it was probably Arlene is my guess, where at one point in time, she went to the library because her kids were there, because she left them at the library while she was driving around looking for places. And it was there were free computers there to look online, to use the internet, and she just didn't even think about it, didn't know about it, wasn't an option for her. And it's just, again, one of these man, there are systems set up to help people, but even just making people or getting people aware of them or willing to use them and willing to try them, that in and of itself is a really hard thing to do. By the way, Scott's story does actually end on a happy note, so I lied. It doesn't all get all bad. There's some happiness. He ended up going to a methadone clinic, and because he couldn't afford the methadone treatment and the rent, he lived in a shelter. But then after a year of treatment that cost him over $4,700, He was able to drop his bill down to $35 a month, and he was offered subsidized housing. So 2 years and 3 months after losing his license, Scott was starting to save for the necessary lab tests. By the way, it does end with him eventually running through it, doing it all, and getting his job back. So that's a good story. All right, story number 5 is interesting. At one point in time, he focuses on the Eagle Moving and Storage. That's a place that employs about 35 people, and they own a fleet of vans and trucks. And evictions make up 40% of their business. And so it wasn't uncommon for them to move somebody that they knew. They often witnessed mental illness, extreme poverty, and sadness. And if a person fell 90 days behind on their storage bill, which was 70% of the people, Eagle would discard the items. And for me, I don't know. What kind of business is it where you have 70% of your customers who fall behind and you're okay with that? To me, I go there's something broken with that business model, which at the end of the day, they're like, well, it's not the tenant stuff that they're holding. That's not their true customer. Their true customer are the landlords. Landlords pay approximately $600 to carry out an eviction that requires movers. And then they pay a $350 deposit, and then it kind of goes from there. Tenants are often given 2 options while being evicted from their residence. Their possessions can be loaded into a truck and checked into bonded storage, or movers can pile their belongings onto the sidewalk. I was just thinking, you get those situations where it's you have these things, you love them, they're yours, they have value to you, you'd love to keep them, you also can't afford it, and you're put in this impossible situation. Do I just say goodbye to this stuff that has meaning to me, or do I make a promise that I probably can't keep, which is, okay, yeah, sure, I'll pay for my stuff, and which just puts you into a further financial hardship, which makes it then harder to find another place, and keep the cycle going. But then if you get rid of it all, you got to buy stuff eventually, and it's just really hard situations. Story number 6. How many stories do I have here? Okay, this is my last story, and then I have some loose ends thoughts. And this was just simply Sharina, that landlord who I was talking about. She nets, okay, roughly $10,000 a month from her 3 dozen inner city units filled with tenants at or below the poverty line. He spent a time in the book that was talking about her investment strategy, which is, it's classic, right? She does the burst strategy. That's what it is. She buys a place super cheap that's run down for cash. She does some minor fix-ups to it, and she's using hard money lenders if she doesn't have the cash herself to buy these places, and then she eventually gets long-term financing in place and goes from there. She's a sophisticated investor, just like the people we've talked about in our investment club, books that you read about on Bigger Pockets and wherever. She's up there. But what's also interesting is that inner city landlords, they rely on 2 desperate and on-hand labor pools, tenants and jobless men. Sharina and her husband, they pay their workers by the task or by the day, and it's typically $6 to $10 per hour. And again, this was in the 2008-2009 timeframe. So my guess is it's gone up a little bit, but it's we're going to go undocumented minimum labor as possible. And guys who are looking to just get some sort of money, they're yeah, cool, whatever. So there's a lot of things that are happening below board here, which are not great. One of the questions, again, that you got to ask yourself is okay, were there profits? Do you feel like their profits were justified making that much money off of 36 rentals? I'm thinking about myself and where I'm at in terms of my profit amount, and they're significantly higher than me, which I get it. They're not spending nearly as much on maintenance issues. And that's, I think, as landlords, some of the decisions that we've got to make, right? I totally get you want to put food on the table, you want to provide for your family, you also want to take a vacation. I get that. But at the same time, you cannot do that to the detriment of your residents. That causes even longer term problems down the line. Even forgetting about the moral implications of not providing safe, clean, and I'm going to say affordable housing, not necessarily cheap, subsidized, but housing that is fairly priced. I think it's just super important to keep all that in mind as you're running your business. And I think this book does a great job of saying, it's not just about a spreadsheet. It's not just about investment numbers. Like, these are real lives, real people who you're influencing and who you have an impact on. All right, I got some loose ends, and then we'll get to the solutions, which are interesting. At one point in time, it talks about there's a We Energies, and they disconnect approximately 50,000 households each year for non-payment. One of the interesting things is that the city puts a moratorium on disconnections during the wintertime. And so it's classic, right? So during I think they give in like November, families just stop paying their utility bills. And so landlords, they often get their rent all the way through the winter because they can. And then it's in the summertime where landlords will now not get their rent because now they got to make up, because now the moratorium ends and they just go around and just disconnect everybody who didn't pay. And so it's this game that people are playing. It's just, I don't know. It's sad. It's tough. They literally cannot afford both. And so they're just making choices and trying to play games and trying to run out the clock on either one of them and jump around. Another interesting fact was that the number of people primarily employed as property managers has more than quadrupled since 1970. I don't totally know what to make of that other than to say, it's at least enough of a business where people can do it full time now. And I think the point he's trying to make is that margins have grown enough where you could do a living off of this. It used to be more mom and pop. Yeah, we own a rental or two and we have our other income, and that helps supplement our income. And so our lifestyle. And so now that you have more full-time property managers, they tend to be a little bit more, now we're going to cut costs and, do things like that. It also says that landlords evict roughly 16,000 adults and children every year in Milwaukee, or about 40 people every day. So I tried to do the math, right? I was like, okay, is this a big number? 16,000 sounds like a lot. So I looked into Milwaukee, and there are right now 590,000 people, or about 430,000 adults. So basically what it's saying is that each year, simple division, about 4% of people are evicted. I've got to be honest, I was thinking about that number, right? And on one hand, I was like, that's not that much. That's a very reasonable number. That's a vacancy rate, right? Not too bad. But I also get it, right? If you think about housing as more what am I trying to say here? If we switch the topic and said we're talking about 4% of deaths that are from something like COVID, right? Now all of a sudden that's a much bigger, more concerning number. And so you got to sit there and say okay, where do evictions fall on the spectrum? It's not death, I get that, but it's also not, I'm not earning any income this month. It's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and depending on where you think it is, depends on how big of a deal that number really is. And I think it's something it's worth having that conversation. And he actually poses that exact question near the end, which I'll get to. I thought this was a super interesting one too, because I think it points to just how complicated these situations are just from a psychological standpoint. There's another lady, her name is Lorraine. She had food stamps, and she had gone through some really tough times. She'd been evicted, there's a theme, hence the title of the book, right? She got her food stamps reinstated, and when she did, she bought lobster tails, shrimp, crab, salad, and pie. She spent all her money on that. It was supposed to last a month, and she blew it all on a single shopping trip. And you just go, oh, come on, well, yeah, she deserves what she gets. She's not being responsible at all. And then he shares this. Individuals like Lorraine live with so many compounded limitations that it is difficult to imagine the amount of good behavior or self-control that would allow them to lift themselves out of poverty. And it just struck me of they're right. If I was in that type of situation, it's easy for me sitting in a nice garage when it's raining out to go, oh, come on, you're supposed to spend that money responsibly. But at the end of the day, the amount of willpower that's required to do that right is so monumental that it's almost defeatist. And here's one thing that she goes, I have control over this. I didn't have control over my housing situation. I don't have control over my income situation. I have immediate control over this. And so what does she do? She treats herself. She does something that she wants to do and forgets about the long-term consequences. It doesn't matter in the moment. I'm like, I've totally done stuff like that too, where I do something that long-term I go, wow, that was really dumb. But man, I wanted to do it short-term. She goes, that's her exact situation here. And it's compounded because of all the lack of control that she has felt. I mean, I see my kids do this, right? Where because for the most part, we control their lives. And so for the things that they have control over, they'll make poor decisions because they can, because they want to, because it lets them know that they're in control, because they explicitly know that's not something you would do. And that's what she's doing here. And we see situations like that where on the surface, you're like, well, gosh, you deserve where you're at because of your poor choices. But again, if you were in her shoes, you would probably make a very similar choice. Again, just like my kids do. It's incredibly complicated, incredibly sad. I thought he had another just kind of a comment here, which I thought was interesting. I never really thought about this. He says, no one thought the poor were more undeserving than the poor themselves. Just kind of an interesting observation he had, where it was most likely it was other poor folks who go, yep, you deserve it, you're poor. Which I don't know. Very little empathy, I guess, which I thought was fascinating. I don't know if I have a specific takeaway other than just kind of it's interesting that happens. And one of the questions that was posed was, if I was unexpectedly evicted from your house, I don't know why, but let's say I was, what would my fallout be? How would this impact my life, my job, if you got kids, their education, your relationships? How might a sudden change like eviction affect your physical and mental well-being? You start thinking about it for yourself. You go, yes, that would be hugely disruptive to my life. You go, yeah, for them too. That's what's going on here. So then he starts to get into solutions, and even before then, he kind of pulls back here and kind of talks a little bit more, a little bit more broader, I guess. When people have a place to live, they become better parents, workers, and citizens. The likelihood of being laid off is roughly 15% higher for workers who have experienced an eviction. Families who are evicted experience 20% higher levels of marital hardship in the year after an eviction than similar families without an eviction. And he says here, eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. So it goes both ways, right? And oftentimes you go, yeah, well, you were poor, therefore you were evicted because you couldn't pay your rent. He goes, well, it even goes the other direction too. Eviction's fallout can lead to loss of a home and possessions, loss of employment, being stamped with an eviction record and being denied government housing assistance, relocating to housing in poor and dangerous neighborhoods, increased marital hardship, homelessness, depression, and illness. In Milwaukee, renters whose previous move was involuntary are 25% more likely to experience long-term housing problems. And so he says it all boils down to a single question. It goes, do we believe that the right to a decent home is part of what it means to be an American? It's an interesting question. One I think is worth spending some time thinking about. He then says, if the answer is yes, here are some things that we can do about it. The first one is a voucher idea. Unfortunately, building affordable housing is less likely to help. One, because the requirements and material costs continue to go up and they rise. And then two, after that first transaction, you got to assign someone who's going to oversee the sales price and the rent and just kind of track everything. So it's not super realistic that that's what you're going to do. And often corners will get cut because why not? We're trying to save on costs. Housing vouchers, which allow tenants to pay 30% of their income to rent, make up only 6% of renter households in Milwaukee. He says for landlords, it's nice because it's virtually guaranteed. But what's also interesting is that landlords can also charge voucher holders above market rent. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, they set a fair market rent, which is an FMR. And I often will look on the website just to see what it is because it's interesting. Now, what's interesting is that because of the way that it's set up, that fair market rent is an average. So it includes the really nice homes, but it also includes the really poor homes. But what's interesting, or the not so nice homes, but for the most part, voucher holders aren't looking at the nice homes. They're only looking down here. And so this is the market rent, but the average is here. And so what happens is if someone's in the voucher program, the landlord can charge this amount. So landlords love it. I get it, and it's guaranteed rent. The observation he makes, though, is he says that this overcharging voucher holders costs Milwaukee taxpayers an additional $3.6 million, which is the cost of providing vouchers to 588 families. So he's making the argument that because of the way they price the properties, it's not very accurate. It's not granular enough. Interestingly, I know in Oregon, if you have a property, I think it's like more than 4 units. I think it's 4 or more. They will ask you, well, what's the rent of all the other units? And they'll use that as more of a gauge for what the market rent should be, which I think is fair. So I think there's an issue there with just the way that those FMRs are calculated. Let's see here. So he says that those who receive housing assistance account for the lucky minority of qualified poor families, and it's the majority that receive nothing. So here it is. 1 in 5 of all renting families in the country spend half their income on housing. We talked about that. And I think, if I remember correctly, the answer was like only 2/3 of the people, if I remember correctly, who qualify actually get anything, which is the majority. Anyways, I don't have my stats perfectly. I think I get to them eventually. So his solution is a universal voucher program. And he says that it would change the face of poverty, evictions would plummet, homelessness would almost disappear, low-income tenants would have more income to spend on other expenses, and low-income individuals and families would have more stability. If I'm honest, this seems a little too optimistic to me because there's still a lot of other issues that you have to deal with, like even just like the ones like drug addiction and mental illness and just plain immaturity, people being human. But I do agree that would improve the situation a lot. And again, it comes down to that main question, right? Do we believe that the right to a decent home is part of what it means to be an American? If the answer is yes, you go, yeah, we're okay with the extra expenses of this to help out those individuals. There's not a real cost-benefit analysis there. He says expanding housing vouchers without stabilizing rent would also be asking taxpayers to subsidize landlords' profits. Which is a landlord, you go, okay, all right, I get that. So they would want to put in some sort of better system to prevent overcharging and make the program more efficient. So again, one of the things he talks about is letting local branches not just do this broad average, but be more granular and essentially give them more negotiation power for the rent amount. I think I would be okay with that. As long as I'm getting market rate, I shouldn't be too concerned about that. If they're trying to say like, no, we want you to charge under market rate, and I get it, there's all sorts of conversations about how do you calculate comps and stuff, which is an issue. And in theory, the average just takes care of that issue. But maybe there's a better way to do it. And maybe it's not just average for the city, it's for different blocks and stuff. I don't know. But there's a way to do it. He says in 2008, federal expenditures for direct housing assistance totaled less than $40.2 billion. A rough estimate for an additional cost would be 50% more, or about $60 billion. So, he says the math, and which is I think how I got that 2/3 number. So it's not crazy numbers that we're talking about in terms of a federal budget. They're not small, but they're not also just like ginormous. He is saying I think in that $60 billion number, I think he's forgetting about like increased administration and enforcement costs. But there's other savings that he's not including. Like one of the things he talks about, some of the benefits of living in a stable environment is you're going to have lower healthcare costs just by the virtue of living in a stable environment. Kids will tend to do better in school, so you're going to have less behavioral costs. There's a lot of other costs that happen in the system, just because of the nature of an unstable environment that will not go away, but be dramatically reduced. His second idea here is court representation. In many housing courts, we talked about this a little bit earlier, 90% of landlords are represented by attorneys and 90% of tenants are not. Establishing public-funded legal services for families in housing court would be a cost-effective measure that would prevent homelessness and decrease evictions. In 1963, the Supreme Court established the right to counsel for indigent defendants in criminal cases on the grounds that a fair trial was impossible without a lawyer. And he's making the jump to say it's impossible to have a fair trial for eviction courts as well if there isn't a lawyer. And then he talked about in the South Bronx from 2005 to 2008, there was one program that provided more than 1,300 families legal assistance, and they prevented evictions in 86% of the cases. So I think, but you got to be careful, right? You don't want to swing the pendulum too far where it's all about technicalities and dotting every I and crossing every T absolutely perfectly. You want it to be a fair and balanced system, which I get. Like, that's not easy. It's easy for me to sit here and say that, but like, how do you actually live that out? Create rules where people are going more for the intent, and not have situations like with the domestic abuse problems with the police, where you made this rule with good intent, and now it's caused a whole new problem. You want to be able to still remove tenants who don't pay their rent after given a certain amount of time to try for it, or who are doing domestic abuse issues. You don't want to have to be where you necessarily need to fill out this paperwork absolutely perfectly, and if you misspell a word, they just throw it out and say, nope, try again next month, good luck. You don't want that either. And so there's this balance that we got to find somehow. So anyways, that's his book. Those are the stories. Those are his solutions. I highly recommend reading it or listening to it. I think as a landlord, it's critically important to understand some of these bigger issues. It's not just about a spreadsheet making an analysis. It's not just about collecting rent and doing maintenance when you want to and trying to figure out ways to squeak out more profits. There's got to be a balance there. You got to be able to make a living. You got to have your investments pay off. Otherwise, your incentive for doing it is very low. At the same time, there are minimum standards that we want to make sure to hit. There are moral standards that we want to pay attention to. And I think it's worth reading this book, having a discussion, and trying to figure that out, and creating plans and systems in our business to effectively carry that out. I think it's important. I also think it's important just to recognize that these are complicated, right? These aren't simple. I didn't just solve the housing problem by reading this book and go, oh yeah, these are the two things we're going to do. No, it's way more complicated than that. And I remember reading a book about budgeting, and the comment that the author made was, he said, look, most budget problems have nothing to do with math. The math isn't the hard part. It's the psychology, it's the emotions, it's the mindset. He goes, that's where all the change needs to happen. He goes, that's significantly more complicated. And I think that's what we're seeing here too. So if anything, my hope is that after hearing my review and ideally listening or reading this book, it's going to cause you to pause before taking action, before evicting, before deciding who to or who not to rent to. I hope this was helpful. It's a good book. I recommend it. Thanks for listening, and just have a great rest of your day.